This is Nauru. It was once the second richest nation in the world by GDP per capita. But, thanks largely to colonial aggression, Nauru's economy has collapsed, along with the health of its people. Nauru has the highest rates of type 2 diabetes in the world, with 40% of its inhabitants affected by the condition. 71% of the population is obese. 97% of the men are overweight, a figure which is only marginally smaller for women. The story of Nauru's ailing health is a parable in miniature, an illumination of the social and economic impact a type 2 diabetes epidemic can have. It could be applied to most of the developed world. Nauru was first discovered by Europeans in 1798, when a British whaling ship hunter stumbled upon it. Prior to this, Nauru's society had been organized around the collective decision-making of 12 clans or tribes. Over the next few decades, Nauru regularly encountered the imperial enterprises of Western nations. Beginning around 1830, European whaling ships would trade with Nauru, offering the island's inhabitants guns and alcohol in exchange for food. The influence of guns and alcohol nearly destroyed the island, triggering a vicious 10-year civil war in 1878 that almost halved Nauru's population. When peace had finally been restored, alcohol was banned and many guns confiscated. Nauru remained relatively peaceful until 1886, when the island was handed over to Germany by the British Empire. The German forces arrived 2 years later. They rounded up the chiefs of each tribe and placed them under house arrest until the following morning, then confiscated all of the island's weapons. The German flag was raised, and the island renamed, marking the start of a 30-year rule over Nauru for the German Empire. 1900 saw a discovery that would shape Nauru for the next century, the presence of phosphate, a mineral widely used at the time for fertilization. With the discovery, Nauru became a nation of great interest to the big colonial powers of the time. They saw an opportunity. By 1906, the Pacific Phosphate Company had struck a deal with Germany that allowed them full use of the island's phosphate reserves, a practice that probably would have continued until the island's resources were exhausted. But then came the First World War. During the Great War, Australia took over the island, and control of Nauru returned to the British Empire. Along with Australia and New Zealand, they created the Nauru Island Agreement, which gave them access to Nauru's phosphate reserves. Nauru was made independent on January 31, 1968, making it the world's smallest republic. Hammer de Robert was the founding president, and in 1967 he purchased the assets of the British Phosphate Commissioners, and passed control to the locally owned Nauru Phosphate Corporation in 1970. Through the money made from selling off phosphate, Nauru became the second richest country in the world per capita, and had among the highest standards of living in the Third World. Nauru prospered during this period. The government even set up an airline, for a country with a population of around 10,000. In comparison, the University of Oxford has about 22,000 students. At one point, Air Nauru owned 7 planes, and could potentially carry 10% of Nauru's entire population. Unsurprisingly, Air Nauru didn't turn out to be profitable. Neither did any of Nauru's other investments. Not a lot of thought was given to Nauru's long-term economic future. People quit their jobs and bought cars, preferring to bask in the prosperity of the moment. According to one resident, hardly anyone thought of investing the money. Dollar notes were even used as toilet paper. It was like every day was party day. Nauru's phosphate industry was booming, and its residents had more money than they knew what to do with. But the phosphate reserves were finite, and towards the end of the 20th century they were running out. By 2006, they were exhausted. Nauru was left as an environmental wasteland, with no consistent source of income. The temptation for many commentators is to blame the excessively lavish lifestyles funded by the good years, but that would be to ignore the bigger picture. For nearly a century, foreign strip mining companies had harvested Nauru's resources during the years of colonial dominance. Nauru appealed to the International Court of Justice to compensate for the damage from almost a century of phosphate strip mining by foreign companies. They were successful, in part, Australia offered to pay $2.6 million annually for 20 years, and New Zealand and the UK made of one-off payments of $12 million each. But the money wasn't enough, and by the new millennium, Nauru was bankrupt. The island remains beset by financial difficulties. There is no money to pay the salaries of civil servants, or to fund the welfare state they established when they had all the money. There is no tax in Nauru, making the acquisition of public funds difficult without any kind of reliable export. One of the biggest problems facing Nauru these days is healthcare. The island is incredibly overweight, with more than 70% of the population categorized as obese. 97% of men and 93% of women need to lose weight. Unsurprisingly, then, Nauru has the highest rates of type 2 diabetes in the world, with more than 40% of the population affected. So how did Nauru get in such a state, medically? Before gaining independence and control of the phosphate, the Nauruan diet consisted mainly of fish, fruits, coconuts, and root vegetables. Its citizens were far more vigorous. But since 1968, the average Nauruan has become a lot richer. So rich, in fact, that few people needed to work, and therefore took part in less exercise. The colonial trade links Nauru had established led to the import of the Western diet, so the average Nauruan began to eat far more processed foods. The sudden changes to Nauruan diets were largely inspired by necessity. Years of phosphate mining, largely by foreign companies with colonial aspirations, has destroyed a lot of the land. It's not even habitable for humans, let alone capable of growing food. The environmental consequences of phosphate mining on Nauru are severe. The once lush landscape has been replaced by barren wastelands, affecting not only the ecosystem but also the livelihoods of the local population. With the decline of phosphate mining and ongoing issues with the refugee crisis, Nauru faces economic instability. The island's dependence on external aid and support raises questions about its long-term sustainability. Nauru's story is one of resilience, but it is also a plea for international attention and support. The challenges faced by this small island nation underscore the need for global cooperation and sustainable development. As we delve into the issues plaguing Nauru, let us reflect on the collective responsibility we share in addressing the challenges faced by the world's smallest nations. The fate of Nauru may be indicative of broader issues affecting vulnerable communities worldwide.